Welcome to the debate. Today, we are conducting a forensic examination of a document that, frankly, many would prefer remain in the shadows. We're placing a dossier on the table today titled The Architecture of Control. And this is not a standard history textbook. It's a controversial slide deck that purports to map the genealogy of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. So the central question we are facing is uncomfortable but necessary. Is the modern world, our culture, our politics, our economic stress, the result of organic historical chaos? Or, as this source material alleges, is it the product of a century-long project of social engineering designed to dismantle the sovereign individual? I'll be taking the position that this slide deck exposes a genuine, multi-generational conspiracy, an invisible government that uses psychological warfare to engineer consent.
Right. It is a question that borders on the existential, really. And to orient our listeners, we are going to methodically walk through the specific slides and diagrams presented in this dossier. We're analyzing the arguments made by the source, specifically the associated diagrams regarding this committee of 300. Now, I approach this with the skepticism of a historian, so I'll be representing the view that while the deck identifies real people and concepts, it attributes a sort of godlike agency to disparate historical events. I look for causality, for proof, and for the difference between correlation and, well, conspiracy.
Which is a totally fair stance.
Thank you.
The dossier presents a monolithic view of history where a few men in a room control the tides of culture. My position is that this attributes a level of competence to human institutions that simply does not exist. I understand that skepticism. It's the natural immune response to information that challenges our worldview. But my position today is that we must look at the actual intent written in the documents themselves. This isn't just about competence. It is about a specific technology of mind control. The slide deck argues that Tavistock is not a passive research facility. It claims they are the architects of a long-range penetration war against the United States. When we look at the evidence presented here, from the lie factories of World War I to the shock doctrine of the 20th century, we see a clear, unbroken line of effort. The goal detailed here is not mere influence. It is the standardization of human thought.
And I think that is the crux of our disagreement. You see a blueprint, and I see a Rorschach test. The dossier connects dots between the British monarchy, Freud's nephews, and, of all things, rock and roll music. My argument is that while these figures existed and wielded influence, the architecture of control conflates their disparate goals into a single, unified, new world order. But let's stop speaking in abstracts. Let's open the mental dossier. The first slide is really the foundation of the entire theory. It's titled 1913, The Birth of the Lie Factory.
House in London. To the uninitiated, it just looks like a standard townhouse, but the text identifies it as the home of the British War Propaganda Bureau. The dossier is very specific here. It says this operation was funded by the British monarchy and the Rothschilds, specifically Lords Northcliffe and Rothermere. And the objective was precise and honestly cynical: to take a pacifist British public and manufacture a violent hatred for Germany to support entry into World War I.
We are on solid historical ground here, mostly. I mean, Wellington House was real. It did employ writers like H.G. Wells and Arthur Conan Doyle to write pamphlets. But the dossier frames this as the invention of mind control. I would argue this is simply the industrialization of statecraft. Every nation in history has used propaganda. The Romans did it, Napoleon did it. Wellington House was just the first to use the printing press and mass media efficiently.
But you are missing the innovation that the dossier highlights here. It wasn't just propaganda in the traditional sense of, rallying the troops. It was the creation of a totally synthetic reality. The slide actually quotes Arnold Toynbee, a future director at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, calling Wellington House a lie factory. They didn't just spin the truth, they invented it wholesale. Look at the Bryce Report of 1915 mentioned in the bullet points.
Right, the atrocity propaganda.
Exactly. This document contained detailed, graphic accounts of German soldiers bayoneting babies and destroying churches.
The source notes that 99% of these stories were completely fabricated.
The Bryce Report was indeed a low point in diplomatic history. It was terrifying fiction presented as fact to emotionally manipulate the public.
But look at the result. It worked. It successfully bypassed the critical faculties of the British and later the American public. The dossier argues this was the proof of concept for the Tavistock network. They learned that if you control the flow of information and attach it to high emotional stress, fear of the Hun, fear of the other, you can program a population to act against its own rational self-interest. They realize that public opinion isn't something you measure. It's
something you manufacture.
Yes.
I will concede that Wellington House demonstrated the power of mass media to an unprecedented degree, but the leap the source makes is that this wartime bureau didn't dissolve, it metastasized. I view Wellington House as a specific tool for a specific war. You're suggesting, or the source is suggesting, it became a permanent shadow government. I believe institutions generally rot or evolve into irrelevance. They don't maintain a laser-focused conspiracy for 100 years.
Because the dossier argues the war on the mind never ended. It just shifted targets. Let's move to the second slide. It's titled The Architects of Invisible Government. We see two portraits here, Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann. The text below Bernays reads, "Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government."
Bernays is a fascinating figure, Freud's nephew, the father of public relations. And Lippmann wrote the book Public Opinion. These men were elitists, certainly. Lippmann famously described the public as a bewildered herd that needed to be guided by a specialized class of experts. But there is a difference between elitism and a conspiracy to enslave. Lippmann believed the world was just too complex for the average farmer or factory worker to understand, so experts had to distill the news for them. That is arrogance, yes. But is it mind control?
Well, the dossier calls that regimenting the public mind. It's not about distilling news, it's about steering the herd without them knowing they're in a pen. The source highlights a critical event here. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The slide claims this was the financial anchor for the architecture of control. It alleges that Woodrow Wilson was managed by this network, specifically by Colonel House, who it identifies as a Tavistock agent, to sign a bill that transferred the sovereign power of money creation from the Congress to a private monopoly.
That is a very, very specific interpretation of banking history. The Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the banking panics of the early 20th century. To call it an instrument of slavery suggests a malice that I just don't see in the historical record. It was a compromise between bankers and the government.
But look at the methodology described in the slide regarding polling. I think this is a key insight. We think of polls as a way to measure what people think. The dossier argues that Bernays and Lippmann introduced polling to tell people what to think. It's called the bandwagon effect. If a poll says 70% of Americans support the war, the individual suppresses their dissent to fit in with the herd. The poll is a contrived situation. It manufactures a consensus that doesn't exist. The argument is that Wilson didn't just stumble into the Federal Reserve or World War I. He was guided there by a public opinion apparatus that these men built.
I think that strips agency from Wilson and the American voter. It implies we are all just automatons waiting for a percentage point to tell us how to behave. However, I will admit that the feedback loop between polling and opinion is real. It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. But let's look at the third slide, because this is really where the dossier shifts from political manipulation to something much darker. The slide is titled The Mechanics of Identity Change.
Yes, this is the Lewin Doctrine. The image is a diagram of topological psychology developed by Kurt Lewin. It shows a circle labeled identity surrounded by arrows labeled tension, and the process described as 3 steps. 1. Apply unbearable stress. 2. Induce regression to a primitive or childish state. 3. Trigger personality collapse and reintegration. This is literally the manual for breaking a human being.
Lewin is a giant in social psychology. His work on group dynamics and change management is used in every business school in the world. Unfreezing, changing, refreezing. But the dossier's framing his work on organizational change as a weapon of war.
Because it was used as a weapon. The slide explicitly links this to the Strategic Bombing Survey of World War II. The source states that the goal of firebombing worker housing in Germany wasn't just to destroy factories. It was a psychological experiment. They wanted to determine the precise amount of terror required to break a population's will to resist. They found that if you keep a population in a state of chronic, inescapable fear, shell shock, essentially, they eventually regress. They stop caring about ideology or freedom and care only about survival. They become docile.
The Strategic Bombing Survey was a grim military analysis of a brutal war. My objection is that the dossier claims this shell-shock technique was brought back to the United States and applied to the American people in peacetime. That is the leap I cannot follow. We are not being firebombed. We are living in the most prosperous time in human history.
Aren't we being bombed, though? The dossier argues that the high explosives have been replaced by crisis management. Look at the list of shocks mentioned here. The assassination of JFK, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, the energy crises of the 70s. The argument is that Tavistock realized you don't need TNT to induce shell shock. You can do it with social environmental turbulence. If you bombard a society with rapid, confusing, traumatic changes, the collective psyche fragments. People withdraw. They stop engaging in their communities and look to the state for safety.
This is essentially the future shock argument. But I would argue that the turbulence of the 20th century was the result of rapid technological acceleration, not a script written in London. The world got faster. The radio, the TV, the internet. These things disrupted our psychology, yes. But to say it was engineered to make us docile, if anything, it made us more chaotic and harder to govern. Look at the protests, the dissent. That doesn't look like a docile population to me.
The dossier contests that, actually. It claims the chaos is the point. And this brings us to what is probably the most controversial section of the slide deck, the Aquarian conspiracy. The slide features images of the 1960s counterculture, rock concerts, LSD, the peace sign. The source material makes a startling claim here. The 1960s wasn't a liberation. It was a containment strategy.
And here the source claims that the Cultural Revolution, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the explosion of creativity, wasn't organic. It claims it was a Tavistock program. This is where I struggle the most. The 60s were a reaction to the stiffness of the 50s.
Well, specifically, look at the mention of the Beatles as a Tavistock project. Now, before you dismiss this, look at the argument being made. The dossier claims that Theodor Adorno, a musicologist and philosopher connected to this network, helped design a new type of music. The argument is that the atonal, heavy beat of rock music, combined with the strobe light effects and the drug culture, was designed to induce a state of fragmented focus. It was a mass dissociation event. The goal was to take the strong, industrial, family-oriented culture of the 1950s and unfreeze it using the Lewin Doctrine. They promoted forced gaiety and hedonism to shatter the moral structure of the West.
That is a very creative point, though I would frame it differently, to suggest that the Beatles, probably the most organically talented songwriting duo in history, were a government project designed by a German philosopher to destroy Western civilization, is to ignore the reality of art and economics. The teenager was a brand new economic demographic. Companies wanted to sell them records. The 60s happened because you had a massive generation, the baby boomers, who were rejecting the stiffness of their parents' generation. It was a demographic shift, not a psychological operation. The dossier attributes godlike agency to Tavistock here. It assumes that nobody ever picks up a guitar or smokes a joint unless the Committee of 300 signs a permission slip.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You call it a demographic shift. The dossier calls it a paradigm shift engineered by the Stanford Research Institute in Tavistock. The source asks a valid question. Why did drugs like LSD flood the university campuses at the exact same moment? Why was there a sudden, synchronized promotion of New Age spirituality? The dossier argues this was the Aquarian conspiracy, a coordinated effort to turn the youth inward. If you can get the youth addicted to pleasure and distracted by social issues rather than economic ones, they won't notice the dismantling of their nation's sovereignty. It neutralized the anti-war movement by making it look ridiculous and drug-addled to the mainstream.
I think that gives the youth of the 60s too little credit. They stopped a war in Vietnam. They overturned segregation. That doesn't sound like docility or an inward turning to me. That sounds like effective political action.
If Tavistock designed the 60s to make people docile, they failed miserably.
Or it was a controlled opposition designed to demoralize the military and break the concept of patriotism. But let's look at where this unfreezing leads, because it all ties together. The final slide in our deck is titled The Endgame, New World Order. And there is a map here stamped Committee of 300.
Right. I see the objectives listed here. One world government, dissolution of the nation-state, and post-industrial society.
That last phrase is key, post-industrial society. The dossier connects this directly to the Club of Rome. It cites a document called The Limits to Growth. Now, you might call this environmentalism. The source calls it a blueprint for zero growth. The argument is that the Tavistock network determined that a strong industrial America was a threat to global control. Therefore, they had to de-industrialize it. They used the environmental movement, which the dossier claims they created, to strangle U.S. industry with regulations, not to save the planet, but to ensure that the U.S. could not remain a superpower.
The Limits to Growth was a scientific modeling exercise. It asked a completely valid question. Can we have infinite economic expansion on a planet with finite resources? The answer is mathematically no. The dossier takes this legitimate concern and reframes it as a malicious plot to create serfdom.
Because of the solution they proposed. They didn't propose innovation or nuclear energy. They proposed zero growth. They proposed capping the standard of living. The slide details how shock troops, this invisible army, infiltrated government and media to push this narrative. It mentions figures like Kissinger and Brzezinski. The goal described here is the destruction of the U.S. Constitution because it's the last bastion of Western civilization, protecting the individual from the state. If you destroy the industrial base, which is economics, and the family unit, which is culture, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. It becomes a return to feudalism, where the Committee of 300 are the lords and everyone else is a serf on a sustainable plot of land.
I see the narrative arc you are drawing, and it is internally consistent, I will give you that. It links the Federal Reserve, the Beatles, and the EPA into one long chain of custody. But I come back to my Rorschach test point. I see globalization. I see the interconnectedness of banking. I see the rise of global trade. Does that dilute national sovereignty? Absolutely. Is it a conspiracy? Or is it the inevitable result of capitalism seeking new markets? The dossier talks about shock troops in school boards. To me, that sounds like a paranoid reframing of civic engagement. People get involved, ideologies spread. That isn't necessarily mind control.
But what if the ideology itself is the virus? That is the core of the long-range penetration theory. The source mentions that 97.6% of people would reject this conspiracy instantly. Why? Because their reality testing has been conditioned. If you have been subjected to crisis management for 50 years, fake wars, manufactured pandemics, media saturation, your civic engagement is just a programmed response. You're defending the very prison they built for you. The source argues that Tavistock has successfully created a controlled environment where only certain thoughts are even possible.
And that is the ultimate defense mechanism of this theory. It's a sealed system. If I disagree with the dossier, it's proof that I'm brainwashed. If I agree, I'm enlightened. It makes the theory completely unfalsifiable. However, I will concede this. The dossier provides a genealogy of propaganda that is undeniable. We know psychological warfare migrated from the military to the political sphere. We know men like Bernays viewed the public as a herd to be steered. And we know that crisis is often used to pass legislation that would never pass in peacetime.
And that is the exact point I want to drive home tonight. We aren't just talking about history. The dossier claims this is happening right now. It connects the Lewin doctrine to the way modern news cycles work. The 24-hour news cycle is a stress induction machine. It keeps the population in that state of tension Lewin described, preventing them from ever stabilizing their identity. The source argues the American people are suffering from toxic shock. They are sleepwalking through their own demise, obsessed with trivia while their industrial base is dismantled and their borders are erased.
It is a terrifying picture, I admit. The idea that our culture, our music, our politics, our very identity is just a script written by a social scientist in Sussex is deeply unsettling. But I maintain that history is not that tidy. The architecture of control assumes a competence and coordination that I simply don't see in human institutions. Governments are often incompetent, fracturing, and reactive. They are not omnipotent puppeteers.
And I would counter that incompetence is the perfect camouflage for an invisible government. If you think they are bumbling fools, you won't look for the plan. The dossier suggests that the chaos we see is actually controlled chaos. It is the friction necessary to grind down the old order so the new world order can be built on its ashes.
We are reaching the end of our time, and I think we need to step back from the slide deck. When I look at this material, I see a reflection of a deep anxiety about the modern world. The dossier links everything into one narrative, because that is comforting in a strange way. It implies that someone is in charge, even if they are evil. It is scarier to think that no one is in charge. But I remain a dissenter. I believe we are seeing the chaotic interplay of competing interests, not a single committee of 300 pulling every string.
And I remain the advocate for this material, because it offers the only consistent explanation for why a nation as powerful and wealthy as the United States seems to be acting against its own self-interest for decades. The architecture of control describes a long-range penetration that explains the erosion of the Constitution, the collapse of the family, and the endless state of war. If the listener feels that the world has gone mad, this dossier suggests it was driven mad.
It is certainly a document that forces you to question the reality presented on the evening news.
Indeed, it is. We encourage our listeners to look at the material, look at the history of Wellington House and Tavistock, and decide for themselves, is history happening to us, or is it being done to us? Thank you for joining the debate.